Hello, everyone. Good evening, and I extend a very warm welcome to this public text series, first in the series, being organized by Library. And before I set the stage, I want to introduce myself. And my name is Pradeep. I'm associate librarian here and work in the library. And um, uh, f- just want to introduce IHS as well. IHS is a national education institution committed to equitable, sustainable, and efficient transformation of Indian settlements, and a prospective university offering programs sooner in masters and doctoral programs. IHS intends and does research in the cutting edge areas of urban planning and theory. Library has been operational a year now with its hybrid collection of databases, journals, and magazines and others. Want to become a best on South Asia in the world. So, and thank you for coming and being part of it. And thank you, Mario and Arvind, for coming. And thank you, Gautam, for initiating this. Um, we have a bookseller coming up here from Yoda Press on this book, and we have a sign up as well. So who are interested to attend the future events, we have a piece of paper, so we'll notify in future. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradeep, for helping organize this, and thank you to IHS for inviting me and having this first panel on queer politics in India. My name is Mari DePena. I'm a historian, less of an activist. I used to be more of an activist before. I'm just very honored to be here and talk to two friends of mine, Gautam Bhan and Arvind Narrain, about a book that came out 8 years ago now, in 2005. They are both co-editors of Because I Have a Voice, Queer Politics in India, a book in which I contributed a couple of articles as well. And we're here to talk about the book in the context of the queer movement or queer activism in India. Um, all of us come from a long legacy of queer activism in South Asia, in India specifically, a legacy that begins in the 1970s with the stories of people coming out and telling the world who they are. There were small groups in Bombay in 1977 called the Londe Bazi Hind. Then you had the stories of two women who got married to each other in Bhopal, Leela and Urmila in 1987. And through these early coming outs of sorts, you had the beginnings of queer activism in India. The 1990s saw a lot of work around AIDS, which was something that happened across the globe, but also in India. You had the early death of uh, many people who lived with HIV and AIDS, many of them activists themselves. And then you had the slow growth of an identity politics around groups that were organized by lesbians and gays, later bisexuals, much later hijras and trans people. So this is the activism that I think a lot of us came into when we started our work in the late 90s and early 2000s. Uh, this is also the world that, Because I Have a Voice, came and spoke to, drew inspiration from, and also tried to inspire politics around queerness, something that was very new in 2005. The context at that time was legally, there was a case already, which is still in the, now it's in the Supreme Court, but at that time it was in Delhi High Court, that Nas Foundation India Trust in Delhi had lodged in the Delhi High Court to read down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which I'm sure both of you will talk about. Organizationally, it was a time when all the LGBT groups that were formed in the 90s were now building coalitions outside themselves, coalitions with non-LGBT groups in order to build a larger support for the reading down of the law, but also to build larger support against violence that was happening against hijras across the country. Some of the most important work around that happened in Bangalore with coalitions with the PUCL locally. Uh, there was this enormous and most wonderful explosion of queer art and film and history and writing. Some of it was a gaze from the outside inwards. So you had a film called Fire that drew a lot of controversy at that time. You also had a lot of queer people thinking about their own lives. And so you had, if you had writings by gay men on gay life, you had writings by lesbian women on lesbian lives. And it is in this context that you have to also see where Because I Have a Voice comes in 2005. You also had beginnings of a lot of um, celebratory conferences, celebratory marches all across the country in Calcutta and Bombay and also Bangalore. Small groups, small celebrations, small film festivals. These are happening a lot, but also with the new visibility, you see a lot of violent backlash that begins or becomes a little more obvious at this time. So some of us might know about the murder of two men in Delhi who were caught having sex with each other, Pushkin and Kuldeep, and in 2000, I think, 4, and the kind of sensationalization that that received in the press. You also had simultaneously a lot of violence against the Hijra community, a lot of which was documented in Bangalore. So you have this larger context in 2005. Um, and historically, I think that's the way I see the place of the book historically. But for the editors, sometimes the inspiration for the book could perhaps come from a small reading group taking place under a flyover in Delhi where there was a feminist office. And that's how they begin the introduction of the book. I'd just like to read a couple of paragraphs from that introduction to give you a context of what perhaps inspired them, and then we can take the conversation further. From Introduction by Arvind, Narrain, and Gautam Bhan. The rumble of the cars zipping across the flyover directly above the ceiling shook the small room almost continuously, sending tremors through the bodies of the dozen or so people who had gathered there. It was a dusty Friday night, not unlike any other in the middle of a long Delhi summer, and the sense of excitement in the room almost seemed out of place. At first glance, the reason for the excitement wasn't apparent. A mixed group of men and women, both young and old, were seated on chatais on the floor reading to each other, raising their voices to be heard over the cars rumbling overhead. They spoke, they would say later, queer words, words of desire, of confession, of celebration, of empathy, and of resistance. Words that retold and reclaimed stories, poems, and narratives that had, until that night, excluded their identities, desires, and feelings. Queer words read by queer people with and for each other, finally being heard, even as the city literally rumbled on its way above their heads. There is a sense of freedom in the lives of many queer people in India today. It is a hesitant kind of freedom, for none of us can afford to forget how fragile the few accepting spaces we inhabit are, or how few of us have access to them. Nevertheless, this new freedom is already a heady feeling, and it cradles within it a sense of hope that even 5 years ago seemed distant. New words surround queer lives today, and they are words chosen by queer people themselves to be part of a new language that speaks of change just as it steps towards it. This book is written in that new language. It seeks to bear witness to its existence, add to its vocabulary, and teach others how to read it and understand queer politics and queer lives. Um, I'd like to start by asking both Arvind and Gautam how they, I mean, this is one experience of that moment in 2004 and 2005 when you began compiling, um, compiling Because I Have a Voice. So I'd like to begin by asking both of you what your experience personally of that moment was, and why you thought at that moment it was important to bring together a compilation such as this. Now, this is a very interesting book just in terms of structure, because not only does it have theory, but it also has personal life narratives, and it has stories of struggles that groups of people might have experienced among themselves. So it brings together different forms of narratives as well as different voices. So what is it about this moment that you thought it was important to talk about
Really?
queer lives in India?
8 years later, you still want me to go first? Okay. Um, I think some of the things that you said um, resounded with me very much about that moment. It was, I was in Delhi, Arvind was in Bangalore, and we, Delhi at that point was a very particular place because Pushkin had just happened. That murder had just happened, and what had happened around that murder was a couple of things. Pushkin used to work for USAID, so he was a very typical he was a very typical South Delhi boy. He worked for a multinational agency. He was elite. He was English speaking. Kuldeep was a Hindi speaking. And we never knew much about him because they would never talk about him. And this is one of these patterns you see in reporting always. When Ramachandra Siras, then that incident at Aligarh Muslim University happened, it took a fact finding for many of us to go to Aligarh to find the name of the human being who was only ever called the rickshaw puller found with Siras. And Kuldeep was very much, his name only came into circulation much later. So it was Pushkin, an unidentified man, and he lived in Anandlok, which was literally across the street from where I live in Delhi. And what happened there was that there was sort of a frontal assault on gay life in the city, just literally. Because every day the newspapers went off. The gay underbelly of the city was exposed. And you had these two competing narratives. You had the rich South Delhi men who went trawling for working class boys, and you had the working class boys who entrapped rich South Delhi men. And that narrative consistently, like it was as much a narrative about class as it was about sexuality at that point, as all narratives of sexuality always are. But what most immediately happened in our lives is that the last place where Pushkin and Kuldeep were seen was at a party in a place called Sadiq Nagar. Now, Sadiq Nagar is a very classic public Delhi neighborhood. It's Delhi Development Authority flats. They look like DDA flats, and it was a place that had historically been home to a very interesting array of parties, let's say, to which invitations were required by SMS. And that party, thankfully, was just a going away party for a Danish or Norwegian or Swedish, and what is he? Was Danish? A Danish diplomat called Uffe. Uffe was 6'3" tall, and he would walk around Delhi wearing tiny jean shorts that were torn in the back. He was a character, But they had left Uffe's house. So what happened is that the police took Uffa's cell phone. Uffa left the next morning and left the country. But they got his cell phone and they got the number of every single person on his invite list, which meant every single person who had ever been invited to a gay party at Uffa's house, which meant that a whole range of gay men in the city started getting called by the police from morning to evening to night, ostensibly only for information. But essentially what happened is when they were brought into the police stations in 2005, it was no holds barred. It was fear, it was harassment, it was torture, and so then what happened is that a whole set of us spent 3 weeks going from station to station to station to station. It's all we did. One lawyer, one activist, and whoever got called. And you made teams, and we had a pager. And we just went morning, noon, and night saying, you can't ask this, you can't say that, you can't do this, you can't say that, you can't say leta hai ki deta hai, you can't say aurat hai ki mard hai, you can't say tere baap ko bula denge, you can't say any of this. But also so there was this sort of moment of deep fear because people were calling you up terrified because their numbers and addresses, and most of these people weren't out, right? But there was also this moment in which running from station to station saying, you can't do this anymore, felt like drawing some kind of line, and I think that's why this history of the book is really interesting because it was exactly at that moment where those lines were being drawn, where we were saying enough, where we were actually for the first time saying enough and saying enough publicly in a way that I remember talking to Arvind about this when we were thinking about the book, where the idea was that you can't just react. A Hijra is found gang raped in a police station, you protest after. 4 men are entrapped and arrested in Lucknow, you protest after. Someone calls you in the middle of the night because they've been taken to AIMS for 2 years and given electroshock therapy, you protest after. Right? A door knocks in the middle of the night, you open it, and 2 women have run away from their house holding their 10th class birth certificate and nothing else, and you move them around. And that's all we did. And time again, it was violence, torture, kidnapping, violence, harassment, torture, kidnapping. And we were sitting there saying, at some point, we have to have other ways to think about our lives. Because on a daily basis, we were not, and so we were all searching for this new language, a language that was not just about what happened to us, but a language about how we wanted to talk about ourselves. I mean, the book's title actually came out of this way saying, enough of being described, we're going to speak. And so what happened when Pushkin died is for the first time, several of us wrote in the newspapers. We wrote in the Times of India, we wrote in the Hindustan Times, and we wrote as ourselves, and we wrote with our full names, which we had never done at that point. And we wrote in saying, if this is a murder, investigate the murder. Homosexuality is not on trial, right? It's just a murder. Find out what happened. Stop making large claims about the community at large. And it was the first time that actually newspapers suddenly were accosted by queer people saying, you can't just write about me, right? And there was that moment that shift happened, I think, very powerfully. And it was a time when, as you said, the film festivals were starting, spaces of culture were opening up. People were beginning to find each other. You sensed a moment where it was possible to talk about sexuality and not just talk about violence. And of course, we didn't want to stop talking about violence because it was such a real part. But the question was, you can't imagine yourself only through violence. You can't come to a sense of self only through violence. Right? And you can't imagine that you deserve not to be a subject of violence until you have some other way of having a sense of personhood. And most queer people we met had no way to imagine themselves as people, had no way to imagine themselves as people who were worthy of dignity.
Outside fear.
Outside fear. I mean, so many people you met were like, well, this is what happens to people like us. That's what it was. It was the idea that this should not happen to people like us took a long time to come. And so I think what had happened was around 2005, the time for the book felt right. Because it was, it's a little bit like, it was that line. It was, we were part of this new language. We, in a sense, inherited from the activists who, the generation before us were really the activists who fought and personally pay. I mean, we didn't pay the kind of personal prices in our lives because we stood on the history we inherited. And I think really to come out in the 90s and organize and publish and write. And then, I came back to Delhi, 20 years old, wondering if it was possible to be a gay man in this country, and met a wonderful set of people who mentored and nurtured me into that space. And that was the generation to me that laid the base of this book. And this book was written 10 years before us. I mean, we simply kind of just put it together in a sense, and it was an astonishing legacy that we inherited. So I think for me, because felt right, because God, this title is like made for horrible puns. It's because. For 2 years, in the middle, anytime someone said because, someone would say, I have a voice. And it was most irritating, but it happened for a long time. But because came because I think it was a fight back. It was a way to take the language back. But there were enough of us to do it. We couldn't have done it any earlier. It's like the first Pride Parade could not have happened before 2008. This book could not have come out in 2000. It just could not have. There wasn't, that sense wasn't there. We met, we talked, and the working title of the book for a long time was actually, I'm out and here's why, exclamation point. Okay, because that's what I mean, that was what we wanted to do. It was meant to be a gigantic, like, forget it, like, enough. And we will write our own words. So I think it really was at that cusp, you know.